Ja, wir starten. Guten Abend. Ich begrüße alle. Die Uni ist ja auch ein bisschen leer im Moment. Aber ich hoffe, ich begrüße alle, die im Zoom sind und YouTube im Stream zuschauen. Wir haben heute wie immer auch einen sehr besonderen Gast, Dr. Margareta Matache. Ich freue mich sehr, dass sie hier ist. Sie ist Dozentin für Sozial- und Verhaltenswissenschaften an der Abteilung für Sozial- und Verhaltenswissenschaften an der Harvard Chan School of Public Health und Mitbegründerin und Direktorin des Roma-Programms am FBX Center for Health and Human Rights der Harvard University. Sie ist außerdem Mitglied der O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination and Global Health. Dr. Mataches Forschungs- und Lehrtätigkeit konzentriert sich auf die Erscheinungsformen und Auswirkungen von Rassismus und anderen Unterdrückungssystemen in verschiedenen geografischen und politischen Kontexten. Sie untersucht Diskriminierung, Wiedergutmachung, die sozialen Determinanten von Gesundheit, einschließlich Bildung und sozialer und wirtschaftlicher Ungleichheiten und deren Zusammenhang mit der historischen Vergangenheit und der gegenwärtigen öffentlichen Politik mit besonderem Schwerpunkt auf dem Anti-Roma-Rassismus. Mir ist sie bekannt als eine leidenschaftliche Kämpferin gegen Rassismus und insbesondere für die Rechte der Romnja. Und du warst auch, soweit ich es weiß, Mitglied in verschiedenen weltweiten und europäischen Gremien in diesem Bereich und kritisierst eine Politik, also eine Policy, die vor allem an Gotcha-Normativität ausgerichtet ist. I know her as a passionate fighter against racism and especially for the rights of Romnja. As far as I know, you were also a member of various global and European committees in this area, and you criticize a policy that is primarily based on gotcha normativität. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jane. Lacho dives Romale, Lacho dives Romnja. It is such a great pleasure to be here with you today, and Svetlana, Isidora, and Jane. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the warm welcome, your support and hospitality. It has been a great joy to collaborate with you. And thank you for the invitation to the concert last night. I don't know if some of you joined, but it was pure joy to see so many gifted, beautiful, smart, young Romani people and to see a celebration of Romani culture. Thank you so much for that. As the title of my presentation suggests, in this lecture I will focus on the genesis and pillars of anti-Roma racism. I will put emphasis on manifestations of anti-Roma racism that may seem somehow isolated, sporadic, and even hectic, but they form integrative parts of a steady structure of oppression. I will also point to a bond between structural racism, patriarchy, and other systems of oppression, and engage with the global literature on race, racism, racialization, and racial slavery. But I'll do so through a Roma lens. So I'll add our own history and our own realities to this global conversation. But before I delve into my presentation, I want to make 3 observations. First, I am a Roma scholar, and my work mainly includes Roma communities in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, and thus I focus primarily on anti-Roma racism. As we are in Germany, I want to underline that I would not talk about the experiences of our Sinti or Sintese brothers and sisters, and I don't want to speak on their behalf. or silence their voices, but I know that Svetlana and Isidora and all of you will have some guests that would cover this topic. So in this presentation and beyond, I talk about anti-Roma racism, or when I talk about diverse Romani groups, I use phrases like anti-Romani racism or anti-Roma and Sinti racism and other similar phrases, depending on the context, the local context, but also depending on the demands of local leaders and local communities. Secondly, the ideas included in these lectures, are integral to a book project, to a group book manuscript that I'm finalizing, so please do not use or cite that just yet, because I'm still working on many of these concepts and ideas. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for the conversation today and the time we live in, the past few months have been absolutely horrific. The Israeli army killed more than 21,000 Palestinians, and Hamas killed more than 1,200 Israelis. The war crimes continue in Gaza as we speak. Thus, in the face of naked state violence and disregard of international conventions, I, like many others, feel not only disappointed, but also concerned with the lack of application of human rights, genocide, and peace conventions, and the disregard for the humanity of fellow human beings. Now, please let me start my presentation with a few reflections on the genesis of anti-Roma racism. I wanted to start with a story, if you don't mind. On the evening of July 3rd, 2020, I was watching the PBS documentary, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, to learn a little bit more about the history of Black Americans and the significance of 4th of July for Black intellectuals. In the first episode of this PBS documentary, Christopher Brown, a renowned historian of racial slavery, said something that stayed and has stayed with me ever since. Europeans did actually develop an idea over several centuries that they should not enslave each other, he says. They could kill each other, torture each other, fight each other in wars, but Europeans did not enslave other Europeans because Christians did not enslave Christians. And yes and no, I told myself. It is true that upon arrival in Europe, the Roma people, like others, came to be Europeans, and in many countries, they also became Christians. However, the Roma people have never been considered white, equal, or actual true Europeans. Specifically to Brown's point, white Europeans did not embrace that approach in relation to the Roma people who were enslaved upon arrival in the territories of Romania in the 1300s, or to those who were shipped to the Americas from the 16th to the 19th century. Yet while listening to Brown, I recognized once again the global implication of power, ability, and success of Europeans to veil, ignore, silence, and erase the history of racial slavery, oppression, and anti-Roma racism within the continent. Today, as a consequence of hegemonic structural and academic, social, and other factors, Roma people have remained poorly represented and understood in the global history of race, racialization, racism, and racial slavery, if they are present at all. And they are also marginalized in the global movements of anti-racism and social justice. But does this injustice cries to be reversed? And historian Walter Johnson inquired this reality during the 2016 annual conference at Harvard. While there, he said, what would it mean to take the Roma, the people who experienced slavery and the Holocaust, the people who experienced an ongoing history of marginalization, to take that history as another starting point for rethinking the history of racism in the world? And I took Johnson's comment as an invitation to reflect on and place the Roma history within the global history of race and racism, and the intellectual thought and work that has long unpacked the seeds, genesis, types, and manifestations of racism or racisms in different parts of the world. The idea of race, the processes of racialization, and the practices of racism have been advanced and transformed repeatedly and gradually within a wide range of contexts, regimes, and also settings. And I'll give you a few examples. Casteism in India, for instance, and beyond, is the oldest and often an unacknowledged form of oppression based on human hierarchies. And some of you may know about this. But authors like Isabel Wilkerson place the genesis of racism, although she never really uses the term racism, in the caste system. Basically, she situates caste as the infrastructure of all systems of oppression. Other theories place the emergence of racism in antiquity, the medieval times, the transatlantic slave trade, or the 19th century biological theories of race. In the case of the Roma people, shortly following the migration of our ancestors from India to Europe, European Gaja, and when I say Gaja, I mean non-Roma, and I just literally mean non-Roma, not in a negative way or any other way, just non-Roma, began to cast Roma families and groups in and as an absolute periphery. The peaceful arrival of the Romani people was not met with a warm reception. Early on, European sovereigns adopted two prevailing approaches: asserting ownership over the Roma people and establishing exclusive Gajo control and residency in their lands. Essentially, we are talking about a system of racial slavery in the territories of Romania and systems of expulsions and entry bans in the other territories across Europe. Thus, I situate the origins of anti-Roma racism within political and collective projects and interests. And I want us to keep this in mind because I take distance from the approach of racism being understood as prejudice or being understood as stereotypes. I argue that to discuss anti-Roma racism, it is critical to start in medieval times. The Roma enslavement, expulsions, the gypsy hunts, some of you may have heard about them, targeted people of common descent and were justified through proto-race, what we call today race, skin color, and the construction of cultural myths related to character traits, later strengthened and categorized as race prejudice, what we call today race prejudice. In the interest of time, I will only focus on the system of slavery because I assume that you know less about this and you would know more about what happened in the western part of Europe or the rest of Europe. But in the book that I'm writing, I address various genesis of anti-Roma racism across Europe. The racial enslavement in the historical Romanian principalities of Wallachia and Moldova targeted Roma specifically for 500 years, representing the longest, and I argue also the first documented system of institutional anti-Roma racism in Europe. But why enslave primarily the Roma people, some of you may ask, rightfully so. To the enslavers, namely the church, the nobility, and also the crown, the targeted enslavement of the Roma people must have been an economically and socially convenient fusion of several elements that eased racialization, and I'll define racialization in a bit. The people who were forced into enslavement in the principalities of Moldova and Wallachia possessed a distinct set of characteristics. They were nomadic, non-white, non-Christians, and non-Romanians. The Roma people lacked both an organized and equipped army and protective and structural leadership, which left them vulnerable to exploitation. The powerless and vulnerable position of the Roma people were further compounding by pre-existing prejudices and biases directed towards individuals of color, particularly Africans, who are already labeled as Ethiopians or burnt faces. And some of you may have read Aristotle and the work of the Antiquity, and there are quite a few authors who talk about the philosopher in the Antiquity and their work under a frame of what I think quite a few authors would call proto-racism, meaning that the idea of race was not born by the practices that involved hierarchies between women or between people, but also women were there nevertheless. The Roma people, but in looking at the experience of the Roma people, we see various intersectionalities, and the intersectionality of narratives regarding Roma people and intersectionalities regarding narratives regarding Jewish people or African people are very much there. And I think it's fair and it's important for us to think about systems of oppression, not only in isolation, but also to think about the relationship and the connections between the systems of oppression. Moreover, to use identity, cultural, and proto-racist markers such as skin color, language, and nomadism, this use of these markers made it possible to distinguish the Roma people from the dominant Romanians and the dominant European populations as, again, non-Romanians, non-Europeans, non-white, non-Christians, contributing to their categorization as outsiders or as the others, or whatever Kenneth Lee would call the Oriental within, meaning within Europe. This process of othering was instrumental in gradually constructing the Roma people politically and socially as non-beings, the idea of non-humans, thereby gaining social and societal support and approval regarding the moral and religious justification of enslavement. What I'm saying is that there was a complex interplay of power dynamics, man-made human hierarchies, and myth-crafting and cultural markers that converged together to perpetuate the racialization and subjugation of the Roma people. Given the economy of the principalities which needed workers, obviously, Romanian leaders may have seen it as timely, safe, and politically advantageous to target for enslavement a scattered and non-white people who had new skills, but also crucial skills for the Romanian territory, but lacked the military, political, and economic power to oppose subjugation. Regardless of whether it mimicked, was borrowed, or inherited from other territories in the past or not, the system of slavery in the Romanian principalities was institutionalized by the crown and the church, and it was not just a random activity of some random monks or noble or some random monastery in the country. And I want to emphasize that this was a widespread system and widespread systematic practice. And I think it's important to think about racial slavery in Europe as a systematic practice as much as we think about other systems of racial slavery in various parts of the world as systematic practices. The system of slavery was an intensive, racialized economic, social, and political project, and the structure rooted and enforced through power. It was a system of oppression and domination imposed through inland coercion, seizure and extraction, and justified through cultural, biological, and behavioral myths, prejudice, and later pseudoscience and scholarship. Thus, I think it's critical to investigate the system of slavery and the related processes of racialization of Roma people as institutional and power approaches and practices, and place the genesis of anti-Roma racism in political and group projects and interests, again, not in prejudice. This may all sound very abstract and theoretical, so let me please describe it a little bit for you to understand some of the features of this system of slavery. So I'll bring more examples in the next few slides. The Romanian enslavers had wide-ranging customary, legal, and social power in their relationship with the Roma people, or at least the Roma people that they enslaved. They had a customary and legal power to treat, threaten, or punish slaves as they wanted. They could control them, although the law prohibited the enslavers from killing the enslaved. However, the death of a Roma person rarely resulted in the punishment of any enslaver. Archival documents narrated numerous horrors targeting adult women and men in my county, Ilfov, and I've done quite a bit of research in my birthplace because this is where my ancestors were enslaved until the 1850s. And for instance, in February 1840, on the estate of an enslaver called Tache Merișescu, two Roma women, Stanca and Maria, were tortured. Stanca was found with an iron yoke around her neck, and her legs were tied with iron. And Maria was also had her legs tied. Another enslaved Roma, a blacksmith, was found with wounds on his back. The investigation of this abuse, because the police was investigating, or whatever it was the police in that day, the equivalent of the police in those days, showed also, and I quote, the other gypsies of the estate also suffered and were victims of such punishments and crimes. Thus, the enslavers subjected the enslaved Roma to horrendous physical, sexual, and emotional violence. The obvious reasons for the violence was to punish them, but violence also functioned as a perpetual reminder to prevent escape, to prevent rage, to prevent revolts by the enslaved. It was basically to show Romani people that they were not human enough, that they were non-beings, they were non-humans, they were close or like animals, some of them would say. So violence was central to the very existence of the institution of slavery in the principalities of Romania. Gendered violence was also a very relevant factor in the condition of slaves and the efforts of enslavers to preserve their domination and control. As in other slave-holding societies, I'm thinking here about the United States or some other parts of the world, enslavers' power over female slaves led to gender violence. After traveling to the principalities, a journalist wrote in his journal, and I quote, "In the evening, the master makes his choice among the beautiful girls. Maybe he will offer some of them to the guests." While Roma women were used as sexual objects, some Roma men were castrated by their enslavers. Moreover, enslavers often subjugated female adolescents to sexual violence. After another trip to the principalities, another traveler, Eugene Stanislav Ballinger, described how an old soldier was upset that he could not take advantage of two Roma girls, whom he had stalked for months, and decided to log them in an infected and airless tank and swore to defeat their resistance by starvation until they died. In fact, as historian Nagu Juvara pointed out, rape and sexual violence were, and I quote, one of the most painful aspects, and for us the most surprising, he says, of this slavery. The enslavers let their sons use Roma girls for their sexual, what they called apprenticeships, by raping them. Thus, and I quote Juvara, such morals had led to the creation of a mixed race, so that there was often a blue-eyed, blue-haired gypsy girl whose slightly darker skin reminded her that she was descended from the nomadic people. Very often in Europe, we reject the language of race, and we think that people are not racialized, but throughout the history of the Roma people, as much as the history of many other people of color in Europe, we see skin color as an important element of racialization and an important element of separating communities between white Europeans and the rest. But moving forward, Delia Grigore, a well-known Romani scholar and activist, and other authors also suggest that during slavery, fear of rape led some Romani families to the practice of what we know today as early marriage. And quite a few feminists in Europe will discuss the idea of early marriage. Very rarely the disparities between Roma women and non-Roma women or white Europeans, but that's another conversation. But I would say that those families arrange for their virgin daughters to marry young as a way to protect them from the physical, emotional, and sexual violence by the enslavers. Many of us know that at that time, many enslavers would wait for Romani girls to become adolescents so that they can rape them. And I said that such cultural and social responses to violence and oppression have rarely been studied, and nor has anyone studied why and pointed to the enslavers who pushed for early marriages amongst the enslaved. For instance, as you can see on the screen, in 1892, a Romanian historian named Dimitri Dan described how enslavers forced Roma into early marriages to increase their supply. There is no literature on this topic. I think I found this in earlier documents and tried to find some more information about it, but there is none. Nevertheless, moving forward, I would say that the economic value of the enslaved Roma people fluctuated and followed a capitalistic rationale, similar to the way the market economies and social and capital accumulation function today. In the first half of the 19th century, for instance, the demand for slaves was so widespread that the enslaved were stuffed and fed very well. This is what the literature back then says. And because they were sold by weight, their value depended on their weight. Even the toddlers were sold by weight. Thus, human value was reduced to their weight. Racialization and dehumanization went hand in hand with trade and with gaining wealth. The enslavers established human, social, and labor hierarchies between the enslaved Roma people. So not every Roma people had the same value. Like the rationale used for luxury products today and luxury skills today in more sophisticated capitalistic societies, the enslavers did not sell Roma individuals with highly sophisticated or highly regarded skills and trades, such as cooks or musicians, by weight, but rather based on their distinctive skills and their crafts. They were considered valuable commodities, not valuable people. Furthermore, the social and labor hierarchies between enslaved Roma people and consequently the price of slaves were also calculated and differentiated by age, gender, and other factors that would impact productivity. So I want us to keep in mind that productivity, and I mean when I entered this building, I saw this quote from Karl Marx on your wall. Productivity was essential in this system of oppression. Several travelogue anecdotes regarding differential prices of enslaved people confirm that, for instance, in the 1840s, younger women and girls had a higher price. But before, in the 1830s, historian George Potra underscored, and I quote, the enslaved Roma woman was usually paid a third less than a man, and minor children half the price. Furthermore, historian Nicolae Iorga argues that the lowest value was put on, and I quote, old, useless, and fugitive nomadic gypsies, as they could not produce revenue, propagate their, what he called, race, and ensure obedience. Recently, Roma historian Petre Petcuț calculated that from 1593 to 1653, enslaved men generally had a higher price than enslaved women and children. Thus, the value and worth of enslaved Roma people were measured by the profit of their body. Each body was counted based in relation to profit. At the same time, we see that patriarchal, racialized, and racist customs and practices were instituted, were standardized and normalized along with the implementation of a very exploitative system. All these examples point to this unbreakable tie between patriarchy, racism, ageism, and I think that we have to think about this mutually reinforcing racist, ageist, patriarchal nature of exploitation, division of labor and the human social and economic worth and value of people in view of capital accumulation. And again, some of you may have read Marx and others, but I think that what we add to this conversation is the racial aspect or the racism involved in capital accumulations. These are some fundamental features of what Cedric Robinson describes as racial capitalism. Robinson does not include Romanian slavery in his famous book, and in the way in which he conceptualizes racial capitalism. Nevertheless, his mentee, Robin Kelly, who wrote the foreword to Black Marxism, the famous book, added in the 2017 Boston Review interview that the first European proletarians were racial subjects. He talks about Irish, Jewish people, Roma, or he also uses the word gypsies, Slavs, and they were victims of dispossession, colonialism, and slavery within Europe, he underlines. So I'm using Kelly's remarks here basically to point to a growing global engagement with Roma sources, which is very recent, and to more awareness about the internal system of racial slavery within Europe. Thus, in my work while analyzing slavery and injustices against Roma people across Europe, I could see that prejudice by itself has never been the principal driving force of racism or other systems of oppression. Racialization and racializing myths, particularly when created as oppositional or hierarchical, have been historically enhanced and used to justify domination and systematic programs against the Roma people. What do I mean by that? To make it more simple, many of us have stereotypes about and against various people, but do stereotypes or prejudice would impact, let's say, the people on Wall Street or lawyers? They usually don't. So there is a power dynamic, there is a hierarchy that needs to be in place in order for people to actually be oppressed. So prejudice by itself doesn't lead to a system of oppression. It is the antithetical, the hierarchical, and the dehumanizing character of racial and cultural prejudice and myths that are created to conceive differences related to prestige, to status, humanity, or worth between peoples that has served as a prime tool to fit supremacy and domination. The antithetical and hierarchical narratives constructed to objectify and dehumanize the Roma people have also served a broader purpose: to control resources and land, to dominate, and ultimately to keep Europe white. For anti-Roma racism, and more broadly, anti-Romani racism to exist and persist, anti-Roma and anti-Romani myths and prejudice have constantly had to be crafted and reinforced to fit the status quo and the modus operandi of this hegemonic machinery. Thus, I conceptualize anti-Roma racism beyond prejudice, narratives, and ideology, which the concept of anti-Gypsyism, very much used here in Germany, mostly relies on. Thus, I conceptualize it as a multi-layered and often invisible web of hegemony embedded in all the past and present state and societal structures, dynamics, relationships, and practices across Europe. Anti-Roma racism does not mean that all non-Roma or all Gage in Europe see us as inferior beings, and I want to underline that as well. But rather, all of us participate in the reproduction of a system of oppression in invisible and visible ways, in overt and covert ways, in conscious and unconscious ways. Anti-Roma racism is not just about isolated acts of discrimination or hate crimes or hate speech. Anti-Roma racism is a system of oppression manifested in theory, institutional and social practices, discipline, ideology, and all spheres of our society. Sometimes we see it, but most often we don't. Its continuity, I'm talking about the continuity of anti-Roma racism and constant transformation. So it's not a stable, it's not a fixed system. This is in a continuum, this is a continuum transformation, have been its fundamental and essential features. And when I speak about continuity, I have in mind various consistent patterns and pillars of anti-Roma racism. And I will briefly describe racialization, gaggedness, erasure, and apartness today. But I elaborate on each of them, and I add more pillars of anti-Roma racism in my book. And please let me start with racialization and myth crafting, as I have already mentioned these terms. Several patterns of racialization have emerged from the resources, experiences, and narratives I have researched. For instance, nomadism, skin color, ethnic distinctiveness, and other cultural and religious markers have been weaponized in the mechanisms of racialization. These elements and the myth crafting of other similar elements transmuted into negative racial ascriptions have influenced how genocides, expulsions, or exploitation targeting the Roma people have historically been rationalized to become acceptable morally and even legally. So sometimes when you see a Roma woman beaten by a bus driver, you don't necessarily react because you may think that a Roma woman may be guilty because she may beg, she may steal, she may be dirty. And this is not an imaginary case. This is what happened in Romania a few years ago. So the processes of racialization employ a series of racial or proto-racial attributes for the Roma bodies and identities, and they are tied to collective judgments towards our characters, our behaviors, our intelligence, or even our culture. The sequence of racialization has included all the time skin color, and I'm getting back to the concept and the idea of skin color, because it marked Romani people as outsiders or foreigners, non-Europeans, who could be seen as inferior and thus dehumanized most of the time. But this was not the only physical trait, particularly because we are talking about a very diverse Romani population across Europe, and not everyone can be identified through skin color. But sometimes we see other markers in a very sophisticated race-coded language, and I'll give you an example. For instance, in one book, someone said, even only look at their faces, they always appear particular. So if you just think about the word particular in that context, you'd understand that it is, again, about some particular characteristics of the Roma population, meaning that they don't look like Europeans. And various archival documents and the writings of princes, writers, or travelers contributed to the racialization of Roma people. And I'll get back for a second again to the slavery and the system of slavery. For instance, many during slavery felt compelled to use skin color when describing enslaved Roma people. That indicates that they were aware about their own skin color, which was white, and its social, cultural, and political power. There is power in knowing that you do not look like a person of color. And some of the archival documents that I found in Ilfov, again in my own county, included detailed descriptions of fugitive Roma from estates. In asking others to bring slaves back, enslavers would often mention their black eyes or their black skins. For instance, in September 1855, enslaver Sterie wrote this: 2 nights ago, a gypsy woman escaped from the estate. She was 30 years old, short and thin, with black skin. She was accompanied by Negoiță, same age, medium height, black skin. And there is a lot more to say about racialization and physical characteristics, but I will go ahead and talk for a little bit about myth crafting, particularly this idea of gypsification through a criminalization, which has been a very pervasive practice that continues today. So what I'm saying is that in this case, whatever we call race prejudice today or prejudice today, in particular in relation to criminalization, it wasn't just a prejudice. This was a myth that was crafted by Europeans, and I'll give you examples about that. For instance, the myth crafting or the construction and depiction of Roma people as criminals in the two historical principalities of Romania, so we are again back to slavery, was a social weapon and a key point in the process of racialization. The enslavers justified the conditions and their inhuman treatment of those they enslaved by constructing and reinforcing this mythcraft of criminality. Enslavers stamped enslaved Roma who were running away from abusive owners as fugitives, deceitful, and bad people. So the fact that they could not stay on an estate and wanted to run away was seen as a criminal act. And it was legally a criminal act. So I think that's relevant to mention. And this practice of myth crafting was also documented in 1639 in the name of a Wallachian village, which was called Țiganească, a name derived from the term Țigan, which means gypsy, a racial slur, but also a synonym for slave or slaves during the slavery. The Țiganească village gained that name because Wallachian serfs, so we are talking about Romanian peasants, white Romanian peasants, like enslaved Roma, had run away from exploitation and abuse. So their own village was called Țiganească because they were behaving like gypsies. So I conceptualize and place the roots of contemporary anti-Roman racism within these structures, institutions, and mechanisms of racialization and myth-crafting, rather than attributing them to the somehow neutral or ordinary social perceptions, prejudices, and public imagination about Roma or the so-called gypsies. So I don't believe in this idea of public imagination and prejudices, and this is again something that stays at the core of the concept of anti-gypsism. Still, the mechanisms of racializations were not solely imposed from the upper echelons of power in society, but are also wielded as robust tools to regulate and make acceptable the social, moral, and legal features of oppression across all levels of society. Additionally, racialization has played a crucial role in shaping the overall treatment and societal perception of the Roma people. The processes and mechanisms of racialization of the Roma people as a forever external, criminalized and inherently inferior other, the singular race, as we are called in 1866 in The Atlantic, the well-known newspaper, have persisted for centuries and across various geographic regions. Today, from micro to macro levels, Gajo powers have maintained and remodeled the old legacies and traditions of rejection and offensive against Roma people's proximity, blending or bonding within geographical, national, cultural, or religious boundaries. They have also preserved, updated, and reshaped the fictionalized sovereign race-made gypsy as an identity, religion, security, contagion, or biological threat. And we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic how the Roma people were seen as a contagion threat and as a biological threat. And also they've been constructed as not necessarily as an adversary against us. When I say us, I mean Europeans, but as the face of the absolute unwanted, savage, and antithetical racial other. Lastly, racialization has entailed paired processes, inquiring and depicting the Roma people and the Black people, or the Roma people and the Jewish people and their race in similar derogative manners. Thus, Gajones, although distinct, was tied to other processes of racialization and constructed in the realm of, and thus facets of, whiteness. But what do I mean by Gajones? And again, this is a construct that I built starting from the idea, from the word Gajo, which means non-Roma in our language. So I define Gajones as a distinct form of whiteness that grants social, economic, cultural, and institutional privileges and entitlements to non-Roma people, or more precisely to dominant majority groups in Europe. Gajones is yet another European born system of oppression that had emerged before and alongside colonization as a response to Romani people's settlement within white Europe. The persistent power dynamics and mechanisms that have portrayed Roma individuals and communities as realms of inferiority, dehumanization, and criminality have simultaneously elevated white Europeans and communities as realms of normalcy, humanity, and civilization. So basically, we are talking about Europeans who became the standard, the norm, and Roma being the inferior other. So there was always, if you want, two opposite identities. Thus, I think that this mechanism has given rise to the establishment not only of oppositional identities, but also interrelated identities, which were hierarchical and conflicting in many ways. So we are talking about white Europeans and Roma people, or if you were to view it from the Roma perspective, we are talking about Gaja and Roma people. In this context, white Europeans or non-Roma or Europeans could not exist as the standard, as a norm, unless they have an counter-identity, the Roma, that they can always refer to, that they can always compare to. Gajones has grown due to tactics and actions similar to the racist measures and ideologies constructed against other oppressed people. So again, this is part of a larger conversation, but Gajones has also accumulated very specific developments driven by various local contexts and histories and specific push and pull factors. In Europe, the Roma people had rather a particular experience of being both cast and colonized within. Soon after the arrival of our ancestors in European territories, European Gaja began to cast Romani families and groups as an absolute periphery. The peaceful arrival, and I underline the peaceful arrival of the Romani people, was not met with a warm welcome. Notably, the settlement or movement of the Romani people in the territories of Europe did not mirror or mimic Europeans' horrific means to institute white settler colonies, occupation, and exploitation outside Europe. Roma people showed no interest in conquering and had no army or tools to do so, had no political and economic organization, no territory of their own, and no power to fight back. They wanted to be able to practice their crafts, which often required a movement from one village to another, from one territory to another. Thus, the European reactions to Roma people did not involve fear of being conquered or exploited. Instead, I would say that other interlocked forces may have led to the Roma people's rejection across the continent and the processes of racialization. And I'm thinking about, for instance, protection of land, resources, and territories, and descent, and their white and European Christians' identity and culture. A rivalry over some domains of power and prestige. There was quite a bit of rivalry between the church and the Roma people who were able to read in palms. Pre-existing negative tropes about black and brown peoples, and also an in-house opportunity for exploitation and extraction, and slavery stands as an example of that. Thus, I theorize anti-Roma racism as a system of oppression. And I would say that having witnessed many instances of injustices against Roma people, it terrifies me how much the present mirrors or mimics the past, and how the same or similar narratives and methods of persecution have transferred or randomly revitalized from one country or region to another in different periods of time. If you were to think about forced sterilization during the Holocaust and then in the Czech Republic and Slovakia until the 2000s, then you see today in Romania many instances when politicians hint to an idea, an interest in sterilizing Romani women. But despite Roma people having contributed to the history, culture, and wealth of the European countries for centuries and having been accepted de jure as citizens of their own countries, I'm a citizen of Romania, European Gage institutions continue to reject citizenship in a more subjective way, and allege Roma people as inferior, criminal, uncivilized intruders. If you want, a disdained people, a forever disdained people. And I would say that across time and political regimes, European sovereigns back in the days, but also nation states and other power holders have pushed Roma people into this, what I call absolute periphery, somehow trapping our communities between politics of must die or let die. And I'm not going to get into that conversation, but some of you may have read Foucault and others and understand that this idea, the concept of must die and or let die. And I would say also in relation to gendered violence, that during war and peace, the bodies of Roma women and girls, but also the bodies of Roma LGBTQ plus people have become the target of very specific and intersectional forms of structural, symbolic, and interpersonal violence. But now, please let me unpack for a second the idea of annihilation or erasure. Because I only have a few more minutes left. And I would say that Gage did not target Roma bodies only for annihilation. The Roma bodies were also targeted for exploitation and many other reasons. But at the same time, annihilation was also used in relation to Roma culture, to Roma identity, and even Roma language. There are so many instances in the history of the Roma people when various sovereigns or various states decided to prohibit the use of Romani language. And beyond that, perhaps to get back to this idea of the annihilation of a people so that you understand the concept, but also the practice, I will start with an argument that Liégeois and Nicolae Gheorghe made back in the 1990s, where they say that policies towards Roma have always constituted in one form or another a negation of a people, their culture and their language. And it's true, historically, many of the state projects of annihilation have been translated into policies and laws prohibiting nomadism, prohibiting Romani clothing, prohibiting intra or intermarriages, and even keeping the group's name and an identity. In some parts of Europe, the same or similar anti-Roma laws and practices were repeated for generations from one ruler to another. Kenrig and Paxson argue that this activity is widespread and prolonged for centuries in Central, Western, and Northern Europe, and they amounted to a slow policy of genocide. And I hope that you think about the concept of genocide in perhaps a little bit outside the legal framework. And if you were to look at Spain, for instance, Nicolas Jimenez Gonzalez argues that the seeds of persecution of the Gitanos in Spain started in the 1400s with a program that was called Pragmatica, which basically forced Roma people to give up nomadism and to leave Spain, allowing corporal punishment or enslavement of the Gitanos who were captured several times after being banished. And this policy was followed by 250 laws, anti-Romani laws, that were put in place by the rulers that came after the 1400s. And also in Spain, we talk in the 1700s about a gypsy roundup, which meant the arrest, concentration, imprisonment, and extermination of the Gitanos in Spain. Between 9,000 and 12,000 Gitanos were imprisoned in various locations across the countries, and families were separated by gender and by age, and their properties and goods were confiscated. In a book chapter focusing on reparations, in a volume called Time for Reparation, we use the term genocide to describe this big gypsy roundup. And that's my 2 cents in relation to this history of the roundup are that based on laws and concepts that we have in place today, the deliberate action of the Kingdom of Spain was really to eliminate or to kill the Roma people, and therefore we can talk about a genocide. But unfortunately, in the book chapter, we didn't get a chance to add all the arguments for it, and I think that I don't have the time to do that here either, but I do think that it's important to look back at our history, including the big gypsy roundup, including forced sterilization, the removal of Romani children from their families, and think about them using the concepts today, being them legal concepts or philosophical concepts, and to see what is the relationship with genocide. Perhaps just a few words about apartness, which I see as a division not only of space, but also a division of prestige, a division of resources, and a division of power. Give me a second. And many of you may think that, well, separation between Roma and non-Roma people is not an issue today. But I think that maintaining physical and spatial apartness from Roma people does have the capacity to sustain gaudiness and supremacy. And in the broader context, if you want the intention of the white people, or in our case Europeans, to live exclusively in segregated or their own communities, has been a practice that has sustained white supremacy. And in our context, we cannot overlook the connection between physical and spatial segregation and Gaudio supremacy. But in the Roma case, gaudiness has also been fed by psychosocial processes, interactions, and there are many reasons for that. So what do I mean by apartness in social and psychosocial processes? For instance, today Roma people may legally be allowed to live in mixed neighborhoods, but very often when young people want to go to a club or so, some clubs may not allow them to enter, or some restaurants may do that as well. So apartness has different facets and different features today. And I would say that the politics of apartness really started a long time ago. But if we ought to think about some patterns of apartness, I would say that we can talk about apartness within the politics of seizure and proximity in the era of slavery. So Roma people were kept in the proximity of non-Roma, but yet they used to live in separated area of the estates. They were not in the same home with the enslavers. And we talk about a prolonged history of evictions, expulsions, entry bans, and prohibition to enter or reside in various cities and countries. And I see this also as a manifestation of apartness. We see it through laws that regulated intermarriages. That may not be the case today, but if you look at polls in various countries, you may see that many non-Roma, many Europeans, white Europeans would not want to marry their Roma neighbors, and we see it most overtly in school segregation and in residential segregation, residentially segregated communities. And there are many stakeholders that have contributed to these practices. We see it in schools, and teachers play a key role. We see it in local municipalities, mayors and the local councils play a key role. And I'm not saying that all Roma people across Europe face the same level of apartness, the same level of racialization, myth-crafting, or gajoness, because there are many differences when it comes to class, when it comes to education, when it comes to the place of where people reside, and so on. And there are many examples to show that, including in Faculteta, a Roma community in Bulgaria that is placed near Sofia, near the capital, where there are at least, I think, 40,000 Roma people who live there. And when I visited last summer, I asked the local people about it, and at one point the local municipality suggested to build a wall to separate that Faculteta community from the rest of the community. And the argument that they used was not that they want to create apartness. It was not that we are just racist. The argument was that the children from the Roma community would just throw some objects to the train that was, passing by, so therefore they wanted to separate the community from that. But the reality is that we have walls that separate Roma communities from non-Roma communities in many countries, including the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. In Slovakia, we have at least 14 walls that separate communities. In Romania, there was a wall built in Baia Mare in the early maybe 2000s, 2010 or so, and we fought back. There were quite a few protests that we organized in order to ask the mayor to demolish the wall. And then when the mayor felt the fear, what did he do? Very smart. Racism can be implemented in the most sophisticated ways. The mayor asked a group of artists from the University of Arts in Cluj-Napoca to come and paint the wall. And after the wall was painted, he said that this was a cultural, object, so therefore you cannot demolish that without the approval of the Ministry of Culture. Again, racism can be very much sophisticated. And I could go on and on giving you examples, and I hope that in the last part of this conversation we can talk more about examples, because I tend to be very theoretical, and I hope that was okay. But perhaps to conclude, I would just say once again that when I talk about anti-Roma racism, I do not talk only about prejudice, and I do not talk only about discrimination, but I talk about a complex and often invisible machinery of control and hegemony, which is embedded in the organization of power and in various axes of power across Europe. Anti-Roma racism is not prejudice, and is not a feeling, and is not just speech. Anti-Roma racism is the totality of ways in which Roma people experience oppression, inequities, disrespect, and humiliation. And it manifests itself in different ways. So to dismantle racism in Europe, it requires a lot of continuous work by all of us. And I mean not only individuals, but also our institutions, particularly politicians and policymakers, who have to engage in systemic reform, focusing on anti-racism. So far, there has been so much focus on the Roma people and fixing the Roma people. By sending them to school. This has been the panacea of Europe so far. The reality is that 9 out of 10 Roma children enroll in primary education across countries with large Roma population populations in Europe, the reality is that only 1% makes it to university or college, and that's not because Roma people don't value education. There are many structural and social factors that impact that. So we need to shift a little bit the focus from the oppressed to the oppressor. And I think that to dismantle racism, it also requires a lot of soul searching. This is a very sensitive topic, and I think that it's important for all of us to acknowledge privilege, to realize that anti-Roma racism does not affect only Roma, because it also impacts non-Roma populations in the most positive ways, because it creates more power when it comes to culture, when it comes to the economy and even social interactions. When a Roma child leaves their home, they have to think twice about the way they dress, the way they speak with the others, the way they could respond or not to bullying or discrimination. A non-Roma child doesn't have to do that most often, and this is perhaps, with a caveat, because there are many children who are part of other forms of discrimination and other systems of oppression that may encounter similar experiences. And I'm thinking about children with disability, children coming from other racialized and marginalized communities. But generally, there is privilege, and there are issues that non-Roma people do not face, and I think we need to acknowledge that, and we need to support people around us and to really engage in this process of soul searching if possible. But I'll stop here, and thank you so much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Es gibt jetzt, wir haben Zeit. You here? Wir haben jetzt noch Zeit für Fragen, Kommentare. Da, okay.
German or Deutsch? Or German or English? Or there is directly translation, right?
How you like.
Okay, good. I will speak directly in English. Thank you very much. I have please two questions. 2 points I didn't understand well. The first one in Gadjonas about push and pull factors. If you could please maybe explain it a bit more, thank you. And the second one is in myth-crafting part. You mentioned the singular race and paired racialization. This also, if you could a bit explain, would be really grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your questions. I will start with myth-crafting because it was first on my slides, and perhaps think about this idea of paired racialization. In looking at data and research, what I tried to do was to go back to the literature of the 1800s and earlier, because I didn't want it to write based on whatever non-Roma scholars have already written from their own lenses. So I said, okay, I'll just ignore whatever has been said. I know it, I read quite a bit of it, but at the same time I want to go back to the literature of the 1700s, the 1800s, and see what was happening. I also gathered many documents from the archives in Romania, particularly my county, because I wanted to learn a little bit more about my history. And what I've seen in the documents, the archival documents, but also in the early literature, was that whenever, or many times, scholars, but also Roma and enslavers would talk about Roma, and in order to describe Roma people, they would give some examples using the case of black people or using the case of Jewish people. For instance, even Romani people who were enslaved in Romania, I remember, this document, some of them would make this argument that they were abused by their enslavers, and they said our plight is similar to the plight of the enslaved Jewish people. And it was so interesting to me to see that in the 1800s, Roma people could, relate these two systems of oppression and look at anti-Semitism and anti-Roma racism in comparison. But at the same time, if you look at early literature, and I'm talking about Immanuel Kant and quite a few other scholars, whenever they talk about the gypsies, they actually, refer to skin color, and they refer to black people. So there is this connection, and in the early literature as well, the 1400s, 1500s, Roma at one point are called burnt faces, which is a term that had been used before by Aristotle and the Antiquity to describe what they called the Ethiopians, which meant people from Africa. So it wasn't like the people from Ethiopia, but this was a term used for people of Africa in the days back in the day. So what I'm trying to say is that when I talk about paired racialization, is this process of mutual racialization. So in order to say that Roma are inferior, criminal, and they are the other, they used the racialization, the existing racialization of black people or Jewish people to reinforce these ideas about Roma people. And therefore there is a connection that you see it in philosophy, you see it in archival documents, and you see it in many of the early literature pieces that I've read. And that's why I came up with this idea of pair racialization, which I define as a process that ties together two racialized groups to transfer the prejudice tied to one against another. Now, the idea of a singular race, it was very interesting to me because I was surprised to discover that in the Atlantic in 1866, you would have a short article about the Roma people, and one of the references to them was that we are talking about a similar race. And why this was particularly interesting to me, I'm sorry, I always move around. It was because we are talking about a century where biological races become the main interest of European scholars. So we see the biological theories of race, we see how Europeans come up with 4 or 5 races here and there. The white race was always superior and the others were inferior, particularly what they call the black race was inferior. And then in these large theories of race, we don't see the Roma population. So they don't exist there. And therefore, when we talk about racism or the concept, the construction of race, which is a political and social construction, and we don't necessarily think about the Roma people. But what I'm saying is that very often in the literature about the Roma people, and you may go back to Immanuel Kant. For me, that was a revelation to read his work and to see how the idea of race and Roma has been, enforced and reinforced through centuries. So I'm talking about the singular race because this is not a race that is part of the big categories of biological races that were invented by this pseudo-scientific world of the 19th century, but is a very singular specific race, which was not seen only as inferior and as a different race, but was seen more so as a criminal race. And criminality has always been a specific part of this. And finally, your question was about gaudiness and this idea of a distinct form of whiteness and pull factors. So I think that very often in talking about a pattern or a concept like anti-Roma racism or gaudiness and so on, it's very hard in an hour, as you see, to just go through many nuances and all that. So sometimes in the lecture, I refer to one specific element or one specific factor that I find relevant for this conversation. But I think that every phenomenon, every action has to be seen through all these nuances and contexts, and therefore to think about many factors. In our case, when I talk about push and pull factors, I talk about situations when Roma people are pushed into a particular action. Like, for instance, if you take the present day realities, racialized poverty in Romania and the wealth gap established during slavery, and which was never recovered, and nobody talks about wealth gap in relation to this system of exploitation for 500 years. So when you talk about poverty, which nobody really calls racialized poverty or nobody looks at wealth, we see it as a push factor for Roma people for some Roma people, especially poor Roma people, to come to Germany or other countries which are more wealthy. Rarely we look at this as a push factor. This is something that pushed them there, right? But at the same time, there are many Roma people as much as many Romanians. And if I were to take again the case of migration, who want a better life. And they travel to the United States, they travel to Germany, they travel to places where they feel that they belong. I feel that I belong more in the United States, not necessarily because of the politics, because I have a lot of critique on that, but it's mostly because when I leave my home, I don't have to think about my skin color, and I don't have to think that I will have to yell at a police officer or someone who would bully or harass a Roma person near me, or they would ask me to show my purse to see if I stole something. So I'm talking about push and pull factors in various contexts. What I'm saying is that there is a lot of nuance when we think about each of the concepts or each of the practices and examples that I used in this specific lecture and beyond.
Weitere Fragen, Kommentare?
Thank you. If you can, I would love to hear more, if you can say a little more about the stakes of how you define anti-Roma racism and not, not as prejudice and individual ideas, especially also what I'm thinking about is, how this, the state is having a lot of interest in kind of pushing these theories of individual prejudice and also doing all these programs about education for democracy, and I think also from the EU. And so I think they're pushing the other theory. So can you say a little bit more about how you're navigating this and what the challenges are?
Well, thank you so much for that question. One thing that I would say is that there are various theories of racism, but if you were to look at two extremes, one would be the liberal theory of racism, which is very much rooted in especially in Europe, in the experience of the Holocaust, in the idea that ideology and prejudice can lead to killings and awful murders. And there is a structural theory of racism, which focuses more on the structures and the institutions and the varied ways in which racism can be implemented. So these are two different theories, but in between there may be some others as well. I follow more the structural theory of racism for various reasons. And I think that in this conversation, a question that Europeans could ask, which Americans also did, is if race is the child of racism or the father of racism. And Ta-Nehisi writes this beautiful book, I think it's called Between the World and Me, or Between Me and the World, in which he argues that race is the child of racism. And that means that prejudice, in this case as well, is not necessarily the factor that gave birth to racism, but in fact you have this system of oppression that used prejudice to justify various forms of violence, to justify exploitation, and so on. So again, what I'm saying is that prejudice is there, and we have it, in relation to many populations, in relation to many groups. But I think that when it is used to justify oppression, then this is where we see it in the context of racism. And again, I think that it may be easy for us to say that, well, yes, there is interpersonal racism, but the reality is that many theories would show that we are talking about institutional racism, we are talking about interpersonal racism, we are even talking about internalized racism and various other levels of racism. And if you are, again, to follow the liberal theory of race, then you would focus a lot on interpersonal racism. Is that wrong? I don't think it's wrong. I think it's important for us, but it may not be enough to focus on campaigns and to focus on training courses. I think that if you were to target and tackle interpersonal racism, there is a need for all of us to engage more with anti-racist education. What does that mean? Does it mean only education on what racism implies? I don't think so. It means that Roma people and other people of color should find themselves in the history books. How many books or children's books that include Roma characters do you have here in Germany, I wonder? I don't know. Or how many TV shows do you see where there is a Roma character? How many anchors on TV are Roma? I think that these are elements that we have to see beyond our interactions, and at the same time, I think it's important for all of us, right, to learn. If you learn about the slavery system in Romania, that you understand that the problem in Romania when it comes to poverty and racialized poverty is not that Roma people are lazy, and this is, again, something that we hear more often, but this is a result and the legacy of a system where Roma people for 500 years actually built monasteries and buildings and streets and whatever is there in Romania without any income, but the income, was created there and the wealth was created for non-Roma. So I think it's important for us to think about racism in all the areas of our societies, because racism doesn't exist only in interactions. And more so, I think it exists through power and prestige. And power doesn't always, happens only in interactions, but more so it happens at institutional level. If you were to think about politicians, let's take the policymaker at the European Union. Who creates policies? You would say, and I've spoken with many representatives of state institutions and asked them, does your youth policies, for instance, include any specific needs for the Roma people? And very often, politicians, policymakers from Bulgaria, from Spain, from Romania would answer, no, our policies, our mainstream policies do not discriminate against. They target every young person. And I said, yes, they target them all, but then who was the face that you had in mind when you created this policy? And it was obviously not a Roma young person, and therefore mainstream policies by design they silence Roma needs and some Roma voices, although they are intended and perhaps with good intentions to actually, respond to the needs of all Roma young people. But if you don't have Roma policymakers in designing these policies and budgets and so on, then you create an inequity without even seeing it. So we just think, okay, there is a youth guarantee policy at the European level, it covers all young people. It doesn't. Any other questions or comments?
And, I have a question. Okay. Maybe I'd talk in German. Ja, vielen Dank. Do you hear? Ja, okay. Für diesen unglaublich anregenden Vortrag. Ich hatte sehr, sehr viele Fragen, aber die meisten hast du schon beantwortet, weil die Fragen auch aus dem Publikum kamen. Ich würde dich bitten, vielleicht kannst du, wir sind jetzt auch schon fast am Schluss, nochmal sagen, du hast deinen Vortrag angefangen mit der Bemerkung, dass Anti-Roma-Rassismus, also sich damit zu beschäftigen, ein neuer Ausgangspunkt ist, ein neuer Punkt, um uns mit Rassismus zu beschäftigen. So habe ich das verstanden. Könntest du nochmal sagen, was bedeutet das für dich in deiner Idee für Rassismustheorie, so wie du sie verstehst?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. So, in my work at Harvard, I teach a course on racism and power, and we look at various theories that refer to the genesis and legacies and manifestations of racisms. And when I say racisms and not racism, I mean that there are specific racisms and specific forms of racisms in various countries. The type of racism that we see in the United States is not the same with the types of racisms that we see in Europe against various populations. But if you look at the idea of genesis of racism in the global theories of racism, and I've read quite a bit about it, we will see that in none of these theories we have a mention of the Roma experience as part of the starting point of racism as a practice. And I don't expect anyone who works on antiquity as a practice or as a genesis of racism to think about the experience of European Roma, because they are not in Europe at the time. But for instance, Francisco Bethencourt talks about the medieval times as the genesis, the moment when racism started in Europe. And what Bethencourt says is that we can talk about the experience of the Jewish people and the experience of Muslim people in the Iberian Peninsula and see that it was not just about religion, but it was also about their descent when it comes to their oppression. And in fact, although many of them gave up their religion and they were called the New Christians, which, by the way, if you think about the Roma in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they're also called the New Hungarians, but they didn't mean that they became Hungarians de facto. But in the Iberian Peninsula, these New Christians were still oppressed and discriminated against, even though they became Christians. So descent, Bethencourt says that it was an important element. However, when it comes to the Roma people, Bethencourt says that, well, yes, in fact, in the medieval times, we had Roma people in Europe. However, it's a difference between the experience of the Muslim people and the Jewish people and the experience of the Roma, because Roma had a different way of life. And this is the reason why they were discriminated against. So therefore, while I think he defines racism as a political project based on discrimination, but he says, well, in the case of Roma, this was not a political project. It was just the fact that the Roma people had a different way of life and Europeans didn't agree with it. So then, in thinking about this theory, of course, I unpack it and just say, well, actually, there was no such a thing as a way of life. There were many ways of life when it comes to the Roma people in the medieval times. If you think about the arrival in Europe, many Roma people settled in Cyprus, or they settled in Bulgaria early on in the 1400s, and then some of them were nomadic, others were not. Some would speak one dialect, others would speak other. There were so many crafts and so many differences between them, you cannot really argue for a way of life. But what I'm saying is that in this particular theory, there is no argument stating that Roma were actually part of the genesis of racism on the continent. Then there is a theory about the transatlantic slave trade, and this theory is very much American focused. If some of you have studied in the United States or have traveled there, there is this idea that racism was born in the United States with the slave trade, and I think that that particular racism was born in the U.S., but there were other racism that didn't happen there. And I talked for a little bit about the biological theories of race earlier, but I think in looking at all these theories, what I'm arguing is that where do you place the Roma people in this conversation? And there is a lack of global knowledge about this population. If you look at some of the well-known books on slavery, for instance, you will not see these 500 years of slavery in well-known writings about global slavery, and there is a limitation, and this is really related to erasure and silence that came from our continent, from Europe. But what I'm saying, and Walter Johnson, this well-known historian, also said it in 2016, what if we rethink about these theories of race, and what if we place the Roma people in the 1300s as a beginning of racism, and not necessarily as the beginning, but one of the genesis of racism in Europe and across the world. And we can think about the system of slavery as an institutional form of slavery and of racism, and this is what I argue in my book. So basically, I'm trying to place the Roma, or to co-center the Roma in the global conversations on racism, and in thinking about the genesis of racism across the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture. Nice talk, Bake Baumann.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank Winnie and if there was someone else for helping with the interpretation.
Ja, vielen Dank an Winnie und Stefan und die Schriftdolmetschung im Hintergrund. Wir sehen uns nächste Woche, hoffe ich. Ja, einen schönen Abend und nochmal herzlichen Dank an Margareta Matache.